There are few names in the grim darkness of the far future that carry more weight than the Ultramarines. They are the exemplars, the greatest of the Adeptus Astartes, the very model upon which countless successor chapters have been built. Their history stretches across 10,000 years of warfare, from the bloodied battlefields of the Unification Wars to the galaxy-spanning conflicts of the current age. This is their story, from the first war-born recruits drawn from Terra's most savage tribes to the resurrected Primarch who now leads the Imperium itself. Long before they bore the proud blue and gold of Ultramar, the warriors of the 13th Legion were known by a different name. They were the Warborn, and that title was earned through blood and defiance. During the closing years of the Unification Wars, when the Emperor of Mankind sought to bring all of Terra under his dominion, there remained pockets of fierce resistance across the scarred surface of humanity's birthworld. These were not the enlightened or the willing. These were the tribes and enclaves that would rather face annihilation than bend the knee. From these conquered peoples, the Emperor drew the first recruits of his 13th Legion. The sub-equatorial Maglev clans of Panporo, proud techno-barbarians who had controlled the high-speed transit networks of their region. The war families of the Sagan Enclave, martial societies that had bred warriors for generations. The oligarchic states of Midafric, whose ruling classes had maintained their power through carefully cultivated military might. And perhaps most chilling of all, the anthropophagic tribes of the Caucasus Wastes, cannibals who had survived in the irradiated mountains by consuming those who fell in battle. What united these disparate groups was not culture or creed, but their absolute refusal to submit. Each had resisted the final stages of unification with everything they possessed. Each had fought until they were brought to the very brink of extinction. Only then, staring into the abyss of total annihilation, did they lay down their arms. And from their bloodied ranks, the Emperor selected the strongest, the most resilient, the most filled with that indomitable will to survive and fight. The gene seed testing for the 13th Legion showed promising results. The Alpha intake, that crucial first wave of several thousand warriors upon which the stability of the entire Legion would be judged, passed all parameters within acceptable limits. There were no significant physical mutations beyond the expected patterns. The implanted organs functioned to projected specifications. Psychologically, however, something interesting emerged. These warriors exhibited increased aggression, and an almost obsessive dedication to completing assigned objectives. They were natural-born fighters, shaped by cultures where violence was not merely common, but necessary for survival. As the Great Crusade began to push out from the solar system, the CS Warborn fought alongside other legions under the Emperor's direct command. They earned early renown in campaigns such as the Liberation of Dios, where they broke the back of a Xenos civilization that had enslaved human populations for centuries. They participated in the destruction of the Scorvian Xenos Empire, a multi-system polity of hostile aliens that had threatened expansion routes into the galactic east. On worlds like Loren Sigma and Seal's Landing, the 13th Legion conducted successful solo operations, proving they could function independently of the larger Crusade fleets. But for all their early victories, the Warborn were incomplete. Like all the Space Marine legions, they were waiting for the return of their gene father, the Primarch from whose genetic template they had been created. Until that reunion, they would remain merely very good soldiers. After it, they would become something far greater. Before we enter the 41st millennium, a simple request. Subscribe to Obsidian Scriptorium. For you, it's a simple tap. For me, it's proof of loyalty that keeps the Inquisition from auditing my existence. The Emperor protects those with good metrics. Now, let the story begin. The infant who would become Roboute Guilliman arrived on the world of Macragge in a manner similar to all his Primarch brothers. Stolen away through the warp by the machinations of the Dark Gods, he was scattered across the galaxy along with his siblings. But where some Primarchs landed among barbarians or in the wilderness, Guilliman's pod crashed in the lands of Macragge's ruling class. He was discovered by a group of noblemen and brought before Consul Kona, one of the most powerful men on the planet. Kona, recognizing something exceptional in the child, adopted him as his own son. What followed was an education befitting a king. Guilliman grew at a superhuman rate, as all primarchs did, but his development was channeled and refined rather than left to grow wild. By the age of 10, he had mastered every subject that the wisest men of Macragge could teach him. His insights into history, philosophy and science often stunned his teachers. But more than his intellectual gifts, it was his natural talent for leadership and warfare that truly set him apart. When the wild tribes of Illyrium in Macragge's far north began raiding the civilized regions, Consul Conor gave his adopted son command of an expeditionary force to deal with the problem. Previous campaigns had failed through brute force, attempting to simply crush the Illyrians into submission. Guilliman took a different approach. Rather than engage in indiscriminate slaughter, he studied the Illyrians, learned their customs, understood what they held sacred. Then he occupied their sacred shrines, not to desecrate them, but to bring the Illyrian leaders to the negotiating table from a position of unassailable strength. The campaign that followed was a masterclass in combined warfare and diplomacy. Guilliman fought when necessary and fought brilliantly, but he also talked, negotiated, and offered the Illyrians something they had never received before: respect and a place in civilized society. The region was pacified, but more than that, the Illyrians became some of Macragge's most loyal citizens, never again threatening the lands they had once terrorized. Tragedy struck when Conor was assassinated by a political rival named Gallen, who sought to seize power for himself. Guilliman's response was swift and absolute. He exposed the conspiracy, rallied Conor's supporters, and brought the traitors to justice. In the aftermath, rather than simply taking revenge, Guilliman assumed leadership of Macragge itself. He was still barely more than a youth by human standards, yet he possessed the wisdom and capability of a leader who had ruled for decades. Under Guilliman's guidance, Macragge transformed. He implemented efficient systems of governance, ensured that trade routes flourished, built infrastructure that connected distant regions, and always focused on the well-being of the people. His rule was not tyrannical but rational, built on the principle that a civilization's strength came not from the power of its ruler, but from the prosperity and contentment of its citizens. By the time the Emperor's crusading forces reached Macragge in 837, the Primarch had been ruling for several years. The Emperor had heard tales of an extraordinary leader on this world, and when he arrived, he found not a savage king ruling through might, but a statesman who had built something approaching a utopia. The world was self-sufficient, its military was strong and well-equipped, its people engaged in interplanetary trade with neighbouring systems. Guilliman had not merely conquered Macragge, he had built an empire in miniature, a shining example of what human civilization could become. The Emperor was impressed, and that was not an easy thing to achieve. He revealed to Guilliman his true heritage, that he was a Primarch, a gene son of the master of mankind himself. Guilliman accepted this revelation with the same practical rationality he applied to everything else. He had always known he was different, that he was meant for something greater. Now he knew what that purpose was. The Emperor assigned command of the Ultramarine Space Marine Legion to his rediscovered son, and relocated the Legion's forward base from Terra to Macragge. This was an unprecedented honour, but one that Guilliman would prove he deserved many times over in the centuries to come. When Roboute Guilliman assumed command of the 13th Legion, he wasted no time putting his stamp upon it. The war-born culture of savage determination remained, but Guilliman refined it, tempered it with discipline and strategic thinking. He transformed the Legion from a blunt instrument into a precisely calibrated tool of conquest. The first major change was organisational. Guilliman had studied the strengths and weaknesses of all the Space Marine legions, and he had opinions on how they could be improved. He instituted a system of chapters within the Legion, each containing approximately 10,000 warriors. This allowed for more flexible deployment and better coordination of large-scale operations. While other legions might deploy as a single massive hammer blow, the Ultramarines could divide their strength across multiple simultaneous campaigns without losing effectiveness. But organisation alone was not enough. Guilliman also focused on logistics, that unglamorous but absolutely critical aspect of warfare that many of his brother primarchs overlooked. He ensured that the Ultramarines had robust supply lines, that they could sustain themselves in extended campaigns, that they had the resources not just to conquer, but to hold what they conquered. When the Ultramarines liberated a world, they did not simply move on to the next target. They stayed until that world had a functioning government, effective defences, and could contribute to the Imperium rather than merely drain its resources. This approach proved devastatingly effective. The Ultramarines began to outpace nearly every other legion in terms of worlds brought into Imperial compliance. With the exception of the Lunar Wolves under Horus Lupercal, no legion conquered as many worlds, conquered worlds as quickly, or left those conquered worlds in such good condition. Guilliman's philosophy was simple. The Great Crusade was not merely about expanding the Imperium's borders, but about building something that would endure for millennia. As Guilliman's reputation grew, so too did his realm. The 500 worlds of Ultramar became more than just territories conquered by the Ultramarines. They became a model civilization, a stellar empire in miniature that demonstrated what the Imperium could be at its best. Each world had efficient government, thriving trade, strong defences, and populations that generally supported imperial rule not through fear, but because they recognised the benefits it brought them. The success of Ultramar also solved one of the perennial problems faced by Space Marine legions: recruitment. While other legions relied solely on their homeworld, or had to recruit from whatever compliant worlds they happened to pass through, the Ultramarines could draw from 500 worlds that had been specifically prepared to produce suitable aspirants. The recruitment rate became staggering. Gene seed stocks were carefully maintained and expanded. Training facilities across Ultramar produced a steady stream of new warriors. The result was inevitable. The Ultramarines Legion grew, and grew, and grew. By the later stages of the Great Crusade, the 13th Legion had become the largest of all the Space Marine legions, numbering over 250,000 warriors. This was more than double the size of most other legions. Some whispered that Guilliman was building an empire of his own, that he commanded more military might than some entire segmentums. But the Primarch's loyalty to his father the Emperor was unquestioned, and his results spoke for themselves. Guilliman also proved to be a warrior of exceptional skill. Though not perhaps as renowned in single combat as some of his brothers, he wielded the Hand of Dominion, a mighty power gauntlet that with Guilliman's superhuman strength could fell even a Titan. His blade, the Gladius Incander, was a symbol of Macragge's heritage and a weapon of exceptional craftsmanship. But his true weapon was his mind. Guilliman could calculate logistical information and strategies faster than the Mechanicum's best logic engines. He could plan entire planetary invasions in moments, accounting for countless variables and contingencies. His relationship with his brother Primarchs was complicated. With some, like Horus and Lionel Johnson, there was mutual respect and even friendly rivalry over who could conquer more worlds. With others, like Lorgar of the Word-Bearers, there was tension and sometimes open antipathy. When the Emperor rebuked Lorgar for fostering religious worship and ordered the destruction of the Word-Bearer's greatest city, Monarchia, it was Guilliman and the Ultramarines who carried out that terrible duty. The humiliation of forcing an entire legion to kneel in the ashes of their proudest achievement would have consequences that none could foresee. But for all the political tensions, the Ultramarines continued their inexorable expansion. They fought alongside other legions when required, but increasingly they operated independently, conquering entire sectors on their own initiative. Guilliman proved himself to be not just a warrior and administrator, but a visionary, someone who thought not just about the war, but about what came after the war, when the Great Crusade finally ended and the Imperium had to transition from conquest to governance. As the 200th year of the Great Crusade approached, Horus Lupercal was named War Master, given command of all the Emperor's forces while the Emperor himself returned to Terra for mysterious projects. Guilliman supported this decision. Horus was charismatic, proven, and seemed capable of the immense responsibility. It seemed that the Great Crusade would continue its triumphant march across the galaxy. No one, not even Guilliman with all his strategic genius, could have predicted what was coming. When War Master Horus ordered the Ultramarines to muster at Calth in preparation for a joint operation against an Orc threat, Guilliman had no reason to question the command. The Ultramarines were the largest legion, the most successful, and it made sense that they would be called upon for a major offensive. That Horus chose to pair them with the Word-Bearers seemed like an attempt at reconciliation, a chance for the 17th and 13th Legions to work together and mend old wounds. Guilliman's more cynical officers suggested it was primarily a political exercise. Horus, newly appointed as War Master, wanted to demonstrate his authority by ordering around the largest legion. The Word-Bearers, who had been disfavoured after the Monarchia incident, would gain reflected glory by fighting alongside the Ultramarines. It all seemed reasonable, even sensible. So Guilliman mustered his legion. 20 of the Ultramarines' 22 chapters gathered at Calth, over 100,000 Space Marines, along with thousands of support troops, hundreds of ships, and all the infrastructure of a legion preparing for war. It was one of the greatest concentrations of Imperial military might ever assembled. The Viridian system, of which Calth was the jewel, became a staging ground for what everyone assumed would be a triumphant campaign. What none of the Ultramarines knew was that the Horus Heresy had already begun. The dropsite massacre at Istvan V had already occurred, though news had not yet reached Ultramar. 4 legions had turned traitor, and 4 more had revealed their hidden allegiance to chaos. The galaxy was tearing itself apart, and the Ultramarines, the largest and most powerful loyalist force, had been lured to the far edge of the eastern fringe, as far from Terra as it was possible to be. The Word-Bearers arrived in system on schedule. Their fleet was massive, befitting a legion deployment. Everything seemed normal. The Ultramarines prepared to coordinate their forces, to begin the joint operation they believed they were there for. There were signs of something wrong, small inconsistencies that a more paranoid legion might have noticed. But the Ultramarines, for all their martial prowess, were fundamentally unprepared for the idea of fighting a brother legion. The novelty of treachery on such a scale was simply beyond their experience. 20 minutes before what the Ultramarines had designated as Mark 0, the official start time of coordinated operations, a maintenance vessel called the Campanile, moving at a significant percentage of light speed, crashed directly into the Calth orbital docks. The devastation was immediate and catastrophic. Thousands died in the initial impact. Critical infrastructure was destroyed, and in the chaos no one immediately noticed that the Campanile's collision had done something else. It had uploaded chaos-infected scrap code into the orbital defense network. The very systems that should have protected Calth from attack were now corrupted, ready to turn on the defenders. On the surface of Calth, Word-Bearers' forces that were supposedly coordinating with the Ultramarines suddenly opened fire. Precision strikes hit command centres, communications hubs, ammunition depots. Units that had been positioning themselves for the supposed Orc campaign revealed that they had actually been positioning themselves for an entirely different kind of warfare. Total annihilation of the Ultramarines' legion. In orbit, the Word-Bearers' fleet attacked. Ships that had been moving into formation suddenly unleashed devastating broadsides against their supposed allies. The Ultramarines' fleet, caught completely by surprise, took horrific casualties in the opening moments. Entire battle barges were destroyed before they could even raise their void shields. The space around Calth became a maelstrom of fire and death. Guilliman's response, when he recovered from the initial shock, was immediate and decisive. He might have been caught off guard, but he was still a Primarch, still one of the greatest military minds in the galaxy. He began coordinating a defence, rallying his scattered forces, turning chaos into something approaching order. But the word-bearers had planned well. Corferan, one of Lorgar's most trusted commanders, seized control of the orbital defence platforms and did something unthinkable. He turned the weapons on Calth's sun. The artificial acceleration of the star's fusion reactions was precise and devastating. The radiation output increased exponentially. Magos Taren managed to input kill codes that stopped the bombardment, but the damage was done. Calth's sun had been poisoned. Within hours, the surface of the planet would become completely uninhabitable, bathed in lethal radiation that would kill any unprotected human in minutes. The battle that had begun in orbit and on the surface now descended into the vast network of underground cities and tunnels that honeycombed Calth. The fighting became brutal. Close-quarters combat in cramped spaces where the advantages of numbers and coordination were stripped away. The underworld war had begun, and it would last for years. During the initial assault, Guilliman himself faced Corferan in personal combat. The Dark Cardinal, empowered by his pacts with the ruinous powers, managed to wound the Primaris with an atomy, a ritual blade that carried the taint of chaos. Corferan attempted to do what Erebus had done to Horus, to use the wound as a vector for corruption, to turn Guilliman to the service of the Dark Gods. He failed. Guilliman's will was iron, his loyalty absolute. Instead of succumbing to corruption, he quite literally ripped out one of Corferan's hearts and sent the traitor fleeing back into the warp. But the damage was done. The wound from the athame would never fully heal, a scar that would remain with Guilliman for the rest of his life. The Battle of Calth was a disaster for the Ultramarines, but it was not the total annihilation that Horus and Lorgar had hoped for. More than half of the legion's muster at Calth died, over 100,000 Ultramarines and countless support troops, but the survivors fought with a fury and determination that shocked the word-bearers. The Ultramarines adapted to the underground warfare, developed new tactics, and under the leadership of officers like Aeonid Thessala, they held on. Critically, the word-bearers failed in their primary objective. They did not exterminate the 13th Legion. Guilliman survived, and as news of the Greater Heresy reached Ultramar, the Primarch realised the true scope of the betrayal. Terra was under siege. The Imperium was tearing itself apart, and he and his legion were trapped on the wrong side of the galaxy. The journey back to Terra would take years. Guilliman organised his remaining forces, gathered the Ultramarines chapters that had not been at Calth, and began the long campaign through a galaxy consumed by civil war. Along the way, he encountered his brothers Sanguinius of the Blood Angels and Lionel Jonsson of the Dark Angels. Together they created Imperium Secundus, a backup plan in case Terra fell, with Sanguinius as the new emperor. But despite all his efforts, despite fighting his way across the galaxy, despite victories against traitor forces in dozens of systems, Guilliman arrived at Terra too late. The siege of Terra was over. The Emperor was entombed on the Golden Throne. Horus was dead. The heresy had ended, but the Imperium that Guilliman had fought to protect was broken almost beyond repair. This failure, this inability to reach his father in time, would haunt Guilliman for centuries. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Imperium was in chaos. The Emperor was confined to the Golden Throne, neither living nor dead, maintained by arcane technology and daily sacrifice. Half of the Space Marine legions had turned traitor. Countless worlds had been lost to chaos or Xenos invasions during the Civil War. The bureaucratic structure of the Imperium was in shambles, with many of its leaders dead and others shell-shocked by the scale of the catastrophe. Into this vacuum stepped Roboute Guilliman. With the Emperor unable to lead and no other Primarch stepping forward, Guilliman assumed the title of Lord Commander of the Imperium and Imperial Regent. It was an extraordinary appointment, effectively making him the supreme authority in the Imperium below only the Emperor himself. But it was also absolutely necessary. Someone had to take charge, to organise the recovery, to prevent the Imperium from collapsing entirely in the wake of the heresy. Guilliman's first priority was the Great Scouring, the military campaign to hunt down and destroy the traitor legions before they could regroup and launch another assault on the Imperium. The Ultramarines, still the largest loyalist legion despite their losses at Calth, led this campaign. They fought across the galaxy, reclaiming lost worlds, purging traitor forces, and restoring Imperial control. During the Great Scouring, Guilliman personally led an assault against the Alpha Legion on Escrador. The 20th Legion was known for its deception and guerrilla tactics, but Guilliman outmaneuvered them through sheer tactical brilliance and killed their Primarch Alfarius in personal combat. Or so it seemed. With the Alpha Legion, nothing was ever certain. But military campaigns were only part of Guilliman's vision for rebuilding the Imperium. He understood that the heresy had exposed fundamental flaws in the structure of imperial power. The concentration of military might in the hands of individual primarchs, each commanding tens of thousands of space marines, had made Horus's betrayal devastatingly effective. When he turned, he brought half the legions with him through personal loyalty and charisma. This could never be allowed to happen again. Working from his experiences during the heresy, particularly from the tactical innovations developed by Sergeant Aenid Thiel during the Underworld War on Calth, Guilliman began writing what would become the Codex Astartes. This was far more than a simple tactical manual. It was a comprehensive reimagining of how the Space Marines would be organised, equipped and deployed. The most radical element of the Codex was the breaking of the legions. Each of the remaining Loyalist legions would be divided into chapters, autonomous forces of approximately 1,000 Space Marines. These chapters would be self-sufficient, capable of operating independently, but small enough that no single commander could ever again wield the overwhelming military power of a full legion. The reaction to this proposal was mixed. Some primarchs, understanding the necessity, agreed immediately. Others saw it as betrayal, the breaking of bonds forged over 2 centuries of warfare. Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists initially refused, and it nearly came to blows between the loyalist primarchs, but eventually even the most stubborn accepted the wisdom of Guilliman's reforms. The second founding occurred 7 years after the death of Horus. The Ultramarines, as the largest legion, were divided many times. The exact number of chapters created from the 13th Legion is unclear, with the Apocrypha of Scaros listing 23 but not naming them all. These included famous chapters like the Genesis chapter, the Doom Eagles, the Nova Marines, and many others. Each took new names, new heraldry, and new homeworlds, though all remained proud of their descent from Guilliman's gene line. The Codex Astartes also detailed tactical doctrines, squad markings, company organisation, recruitment practices, and even religious instruction. It was meant to be a living document, updated with lessons learned from each new war. Guilliman never intended it to be followed dogmatically, but rather to serve as a foundation upon which chapters could build their own traditions and adapt to their specific circumstances. But Guilliman's reforms went beyond just the Space Marines. He reorganised the Council of Terror, creating the structure of the High Lords that would rule the Imperium for the next 10,000 years. He established clearer divisions of authority between different branches of imperial power, ensuring that no single individual or institution could accumulate too much control. He worked to restore trade routes, rebuild infrastructure, and return the Imperium to something approaching normal function. Yet even as he rebuilt civilization, the Great Scouring continued. The traitor legions had fled to the Eye of Terror, but they launched raids and counterattacks, trying to destabilize the Imperium's recovery. And Guilliman, feeling responsible for the failure to reach Terra in time, drove himself relentlessly to hunt down every last traitor. It was this drive that led him to the Battle of Thessala. In 121, just over a century after the heresy began, Guilliman finally cornered his brother Fulgrim. The Primarch of the Emperor's Children had ascended to demonhood, empowered by Slanesh into a serpentine monstrosity of terrible power. Guilliman gathered a strike force of Ultramarines and successor chapters and engaged Fulgrim's fleet at Thessala. The space battle was brutal. The Emperor's children, though outnumbered, fought with the desperate fury of the damned. Guilliman's tactical genius allowed the Loyalists to create an opening, a momentary gap in the void shields of Fulgrim's flagship, the pride of the Emperor. Seeing a chance to end the battle quickly and save his fleet from total annihilation, Guilliman led a teleportation assault with 100 Ultramarines directly onto his brother's ship. They fought through the Triumphal Way, that grand corridor that Fulgrim had designed to showcase the glory of his legion. Bodies of Ultramarines and Emperor's children littered the path. When they reached the Heliopolis, Guilliman made a decision that his officers, Aeonid Thiel and First Captain Andros, immediately questioned. He would face Fulgrim alone. Guilliman justified this by claiming he could distract his brother long enough for the assault teams to disable the pride of the Emperor. Thiel and Andros suspected the truth, that their Primarch's pride and guilt were driving him to seek personal vengeance. They agreed to stand back only on the condition that Guilliman call for aid if he needed it. The duel that followed was less a contest than an execution. Fulgrim, empowered by the warp, enhanced by his demonic ascension, wielded speed and strength that no mortal form could match. Even before his fall, Fulgrim had been perhaps the greatest swordsman among the Primarchs. Now, as a demon prince, he was simply overwhelming. Guilliman fought valiantly, but he was outmatched. When he realised he was about to die, he called for Thiel and Andros as he had promised. But Fulgrim was ready. A horde of Emperor's children had been lying in wait, and as the Ultramarines' reinforcements entered the Heliopolis, the trap was sprung. In the chaos of the larger battle, Fulgrim's poisoned blade found its mark. With his warp-enhanced senses, the demon Primarch saw the scar that Corfaron's Athame had left on Guilliman's throat during the Battle of Calth. He struck there, slashing open the old wound with a blade that carried the taint of the Prince of Pleasure. Guilliman collapsed. Thiel and the surviving Ultramarines managed to teleport their Primarch back to the Gauntlet of Power, but the damage was done. The poison was beyond the ability of any apothecary to neutralize. Guilliman was dying, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The solution they found was desperate: stasis. If they could not heal him, they could at least prevent him from dying. Guilliman's barely living body was encased in a stasis field and transported back to Macragge. There, in the Temple of Correction within the Fortress of Hera, he was enthroned. The stasis field kept him frozen at the moment between life and death, his throat still bearing the wound that had struck him down, his blood visible as a delicate necklace around his throat. For 10,000 years, Roboute Guilliman sat upon that throne. The Ultramarines maintained a vigil, generation after generation. The Temple of Correction became one of the holiest sites in the entire Imperium. Pilgrims travelled from across the galaxy to see the preserved body of a Primarch, to witness this relic of a bygone age. Some claimed that the wound was slowly healing, that even within the stasis field, Guilliman's superhuman physiology was fighting the poison. Others dismissed this as wishful thinking, pointing out the impossibility of any change within an active stasis field. But the stories persisted, and the faithful continued to believe in the miracle of the Primarch. During those 10 millennia, the Ultramarines and their successor chapters carried on Guilliman's legacy. They followed the Codex Astartes, though their interpretation of it grew more rigid over time, transforming Guilliman's practical guidelines into something approaching Holy Writ. The Ultramarines became known as the most orthodox of all Codex chapters, the exemplars of what a Space Marine chapter should be. The chapter masters who succeeded Guilliman included legendary warriors like Maneus Calgar, who would lead the Ultramarines through some of their darkest hours. When Hive Fleet Behemoth, the first major Tyranid invasion, struck Ultramar, it was Calgar who organised the defence, who fought on even after losing all his limbs in battle against a Tyranid Hive tyrant, who coordinated the counterattack that finally destroyed the Hive Fleet at the Battle for Macragge. The successor chapters of the Ultramarines spread across the galaxy, each developing their own culture while maintaining pride in their heritage. The Mortifactors, the Doom Eagles, the Nova Marines, the Genesis chapter, and hundreds of others. It is estimated that approximately 2/3 of all Space Marine chapters can trace their gene seed back to Roboute Guilliman, making the Ultramarines gene line the most successful and widely distributed in the Imperium. Through all those millennia, through the countless wars and crises that racked the Imperium, the Ultramarines remained steadfast. They were the bulwark against which the enemies of humanity broke. They were the example that other chapters sought to emulate, and always, in the back of every Ultramarine's mind, was the knowledge that their primarchs sat frozen in the Temple of Correction, neither dead nor alive, waiting. What none of them knew was that the galaxy was about to change in ways that would dwarf even the Horus Heresy. 10,000 years after his fall, Abaddon the Despoiler, Warmaster of Chaos and former first captain of the Sons of Horus, launched his 13th Black Crusade from the Eye of Terror. This was not merely another raid or limited offensive. This was total war, the culmination of Abaddon's 10 millennia-long strategy to finally destroy the Imperium of Man. The focal point of the assault was Cadia, the fortress world that guarded the only stable route from the Eye of Terror into Imperial space. If Cadia fell, the floodgates would open, and the forces of chaos would pour into the galaxy in numbers not seen since the Horus Heresy. The Imperium committed every resource it could spare to Cadia's defence, but Abaddon had prepared well. As the battle raged, Abaddon employed the terrible weapons he had gathered over millennia, including a blackstone fortress of terrible power. The final assault on Cadia was apocalyptic. When conventional weapons proved insufficient, Abaddon did the unthinkable. He rammed the blackstone fortress directly into Cadia itself. The world broke. Cadia, the fortress that had stood for 10,000 years, the linchpin of the Imperium's defence against chaos, was destroyed. And in its destruction, something far worse occurred. The psychic shockwave of billions of deaths, combined with the raw warp energy unleashed by the Blackstone Fortress's impact, tore reality itself asunder. The Great Rift opened. A massive warp storm, larger than any seen since the Age of Strife, split the galaxy in two. On one side, the Imperium Sanctus, still tenuously connected to Terra. On the other, the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, cut off from the light of the Astronomicon and drowning in the darkness. Warp storms erupted across the galaxy. Demon invasions became commonplace. The carefully maintained infrastructure of the Imperium began to collapse under the strain. But in the chaos of Cadia's fall, a group of survivors escaped into the Webway, the ancient network of tunnels through the warp created by the Eldari. This group included tech priest Belisarius Cal, the living St. Celestine, and a contingent of Grey Knights led by Grandmaster Aldrich Voldus. And they were carrying something precious: hope. Carl revealed that 10,000 years ago, Roboute Guilliman had given him 2 tasks to complete in the event of the Primarch's incapacitation. The first was to develop a new generation of Space Marines, superior to the original template. This task had been completed, and the fruits of that labour were the Primaris Space Marines, hundreds of thousands of enhanced Astartes waiting in stasis for their moment to awaken. The second task was far more challenging: to find a way to restore Guilliman himself to life. The survivors made their way through the Webway to Macragge, where they found Ultramar under assault by forces of the Black Legion. Abaddon, informed by his sorcerers of Call's mission, was determined to prevent Guilliman's resurrection. If the Primarch returned, he could rally the Imperium in ways that no other leader could. But the defenders of Ultramar held. Marneus Calgar, despite his reservations about the Xenos allies that Celestine and Carl had brought, allowed them access to the Temple of Correction. Time was running short. The Black Legion was at the gates, pouring into the temple itself, determined to destroy both Guilliman's body and those who sought to revive him. Belisarius Cal worked with terrible urgency, employing technology that blended the arcane sciences of the Mechanicus with the psychic mysticism of the Eldari. The Armour of Fate, a suit of artificer armour that Karl had been perfecting for 10 millennia, was designed not just to protect but to sustain life itself. The Emperor's sword, a blade imbued with a portion of the Emperor's own psychic might, would serve as both weapon and symbol of Guilliman's authority. As the Black Legion forces breached the inner sanctum, as Chaos Space Marines poured into the chamber where Guilliman's throne sat, Call completed his work. The stasis field collapsed. The Armour of Fate was affixed to Guilliman's body, the systems activated, and Roboute Guilliman drew breath. The Primarch's first conscious act in 10,000 years was to reach for the Emperor's sword. His second was to launch himself into the oncoming horde of Black Legionaries. The battle that followed was brief and absolutely one-sided. A Primarch, armed with a weapon carrying the Emperor's own power, facing Chaos Space Marines was not a fight. It was an execution. The Black Legion fled. Ultramar was saved, and the Imperium had gained something it had lacked for 10 millennia. A Primarch, one of the Emperor's own gene sons, returned to lead humanity in its darkest hour. Guilliman's awakening was not a simple matter of opening his eyes and continuing where he had left off. He had fallen in 121, in the early 31st millennium. He awoke in 999, in the late 41st millennium. 10,000 years had passed, and the Imperium he returned to was almost unrecognisable. His first meetings with the Ultramarines' current leadership were bittersweet. He saw in Marneus Calgar and the others warriors of exceptional skill and dedication, but also men who had been shaped by 10,000 years of grinding warfare and religious dogma. They revered him not as a leader but as a demigod, an object of worship rather than a commander. The Codex Astartes that he had written as a flexible framework had become a rigid scripture, its every word debated by scholars and treated as holy writ. But there was no time for lengthy adjustments. Guilliman was briefed on the current state of the Imperium, and what he learned filled him with horror and disgust. The Imperium that he had helped build, the rational, expanding civilization dedicated to the betterment of humanity, had become a rotting theocracy. The Emperor, who had explicitly rejected being worshipped as a god, was now the central figure of a galaxy-spanning religion. Superstition had replaced science. Corruption was endemic. Entire sectors were ruled by petty tyrants who cared nothing for the people they governed. And yet, for all its decay, the Imperium endured. Trillions of humans across hundreds of thousands of worlds continued to survive, to fight, to maintain some semblance of civilization against the horrors of the 41st millennium. That alone was a testament to human resilience. Guilliman declared his intention to reach Terra and take direct command of the Imperium. He was, after all, still technically the Lord Commander and Imperial Regent, positions he had held since the end of the Heresy. But the journey from Ultramar to Terra, which should have been a matter of weeks through the warp, became a nightmarish crusade through a galaxy tearing itself apart. The Terran Crusade, as it came to be known, saw Guilliman's fleet battling through warp storms, demon invasions, and traitor forces at every turn. Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons ambushed them at the edge of the Maelstrom. The Red Corsairs, led by Huron Blackheart, launched desperate boarding actions. Kairos Fateweaver, the demon oracle of Tzeentch, nearly captured Guilliman, trapping him in psychic chains and forcing the fleet to surrender. But each time, through a combination of brilliant tactics, incredible determination, and more than a little luck, Guilliman's forces prevailed. They escaped the Maelstrom trap. They fought off Magnus on Luna when the Crimson King attempted one final assault before Guilliman could reach Terra, and finally, bloodied but unbroken, the Primarch stood before the gates of the Imperial Palace. He requested an audience with his father. What passed between Guilliman and the Emperor during that meeting is not recorded. The Primarch entered the Sanctum Imperialis alone and emerged hours later. Those who saw him said he looked shaken, that for the first time since his resurrection, the Lord Commander appeared uncertain. Whatever truths the Emperor shared with him, whatever guidance or commands he received, Guilliman kept to himself. But his course of action was clear. He declared himself Lord Commander of the Imperium and Imperial Regent once more, taking direct control of the Imperium's military and political apparatus. He reorganized the High Lords of Terror, removing those who had become corrupt or ineffective, installing new leadership that he believed could actually govern, and then he unveiled Belisarius Cal's other great work, the Primaris Space Marines. The Primaris Space Marines represented the culmination of 10,000 years of genetic research and development, using the Sancprimus Portum, an artifact that contained genetic information from all 20 original Primarchs. Cal had refined and improved upon the Emperor's original Space Marine template. The result was a new breed of Astartes, taller, stronger, more resilient, and equipped with superior war gear. The Primaris modifications included 3 additional organs beyond the standard 19 of a normal Space Marine. The Magnifica enhanced their physical strength and resilience even further. The Belisarian Furnace provided enhanced healing capabilities. The sinew coils reinforced their muscles and connective tissue. Together, these upgrades produced warriors who stood nearly as tall as the ancient Astartes of the Great Crusade, capable of feats that would strain even a normal Space Marine. But the true genius of Cal's work was not just the enhancement of individual warriors. He had also developed new weapons and armour to equip them. The Mark X power armour, modular and adaptable, could be configured for different combat roles. Bolt rifles with improved range and stopping power, repulsor grav tanks that combined the firepower of the Predator with the transport capacity of the Rhino and the ability to fly. Guilliman had already begun deploying these Primaris Marines during the Terran Crusade as part of the Unnumbered Sons, massive formations that fought together regardless of their destined chapter. But now, with the Imperium secured and his position as Lord Commander re-established, Guilliman could unveil the true scope of his plan. The Ultima founding created hundreds of new Ultramarines chapters, whole brotherhoods of these enhanced warriors dispatched to critical war zones across the galaxy. Existing chapters, many depleted by the constant warfare of the 41st millennium, received Primaris reinforcements. Some chapter masters welcomed these new warriors gladly. Others viewed them with suspicion, seeing them as Cals meddling with the Emperor's sacred work. To ensure acceptance, Guilliman deployed contingents of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own guardians, as emissaries imperatus. Their presence made it clear that the Primaris Marines came with the Emperor's blessing. One does not refuse a gift from the Master of Mankind. Not all existing Space Marines could simply be replaced by Primaris, nor did Guilliman wish for that. But Cal had developed procedures to enhance Firstborn Marines into Primaris, a dangerous set of surgeries known as crossing the Rubicon Primaris. The process was risky, with a significant failure rate, but for those who survived it granted them the enhanced capabilities of the Primaris Marines, while retaining all their experience and knowledge. Manius Calgar was the first chapter master to undergo this transformation, setting an example for other leaders. His successful crossing of the Rubicon Primaris was seen as a sign of the Emperor's favour, and encouraged other chapters to accept the enhancements. With his new armies assembled and his political position secured, Guilliman launched the Indomitus Crusade. The Indomitus Crusade was the largest military campaign since the Great Crusade itself. Guilliman assembled a force that dwarfed anything the Imperium had deployed in millennia, hundreds of Primaris Marine chapters, both newly founded and reinforcements for existing chapters, regiments of Astra Militarum numbering in the billions, fleets of the Imperial Navy, Titan legions, knight houses, elements of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Sisters of Battle, and even small contingents of the Adeptus Custodes and Sisters of Silence. The goal was nothing less than to reclaim the Imperium, to push back the tides of chaos and Xenos that had surged forth in the wake of the Great Rift's opening, to restore order to a galaxy descending into madness. The Crusade split into multiple fleets, each commanded by experienced leaders and tasked with liberating entire sectors. Guilliman himself led the primary fleet, striking at the most critical targets, The early campaigns were stunningly successful. World after world was liberated from Chaos occupation. Tyrannid hive fleets were intercepted and destroyed. Orc ways were broken before they could gather momentum. But the campaign was not without cost. The Plague Wars saw Guilliman face his traitorous brother Mortarion, the demon primarch of the Death Guard, in brutal combat across the worlds of Ultramar. Nurgle's forces had invaded the 500 worlds, seeking to corrupt Guilliman's own realm into a festering garden of decay. The fighting was apocalyptic, with billions dying to plague and warfare. Guilliman ultimately prevailed, even burning a portion of Nurgle's garden itself by channeling the Emperor's power through the Emperor's sword. But the victory was Pyrrhic. Ultramar was saved, but at a terrible cost in lives and infrastructure. The Indomitus Crusade continues even now, in the early years of the 42nd millennium. Guilliman has learned that the galaxy is far too vast, the enemies of humanity far too numerous, for even a Primarch to triumph everywhere at once. He has had to make hard choices, to abandon some worlds so that others might be saved, to calculate the cold mathematics of triage on a galactic scale. His relationship with the current Imperium remains complicated. He sees the superstition, corruption, and inefficiency that plague every level of Imperial governance. But he also sees the incredible courage and determination of ordinary humans who fight against impossible odds. He has come to understand that the Imperium, for all its flaws, is what has kept humanity alive through 10,000 years of constant warfare. It may be a rotting edifice, but it is the only edifice humanity has, and so Guilliman fights on. He reorganises where he can, reforms what he is able, and leads from the front when necessary. The Codex Astartes has been updated for the first time in 10 millennia, incorporating lessons learned from the Indomitus Crusade and adding new formations built around the Primaris Marines. The command structure of the Astra Militarum has been streamlined, new fleets are being constructed, the Imperium is being rebuilt, not into the shining civilization that Guilliman once envisioned, but into something that can survive the nightmare of the current age. Today, the Ultramarines and their successor chapters stand as they always have, as exemplars of what the Adeptus Astartes should be. The Ultramarines themselves, now a mixed force of Firstborn and Primaris Marines, continue to recruit from the 500 worlds of Ultramar. Their fortress monastery, the Fortress of Hera, remains one of the most formidable structures in the Imperium, its halls echoing with 10,000 years of history. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar, now enhanced by his crossing of the Rubicon Primaris, leads the chapter in Guilliman's absence when the Primarch is away on campaign. The first company, the Veteran Company, consists entirely of those who have proven themselves in hundreds of battles. The second through fifth companies are the Battle Companies, ready to deploy at a moment's notice to any war zone. The sixth through ninth are the Reserve Companies, providing support and reinforcement. The 10th Company trains the Scouts, the neophytes who will one day become full battle brothers. The successor chapters number in the hundreds, possibly more than 1,000. Some, like the Genesis chapter and the Aurora chapter, adhere closely to the Codex Astartes and maintain close ties with their parent chapter. Others, like the Mortifactors with their death cult traditions or the Black Consuls with their aggressive tactics, have developed their own unique cultures while still honouring their Ultramarines' heritage. With the Ultima founding, new chapters bearing Ultramarines' gene seed have been created. All Primaris forces like the Praetors of Ultramar who defend Greater Ultramar, or mixed-generation chapters like countless others spread across the galaxy. The gene seed of Roboute Guilliman has proven remarkably stable over the millennia, showing fewer mutations and deviations than almost any other Primarch's legacy. The Ultramarines' relationship with their Primarch is complex in this new age. Those who remember him from before his fall are long dead, their knowledge passed down through oral tradition and written records. To the current generation of Ultramarines, Guilliman is both a living legend and a practical commander, both the Gene Father who created them, and a flesh and blood warrior who fights beside them. Guilliman himself has had to adjust to commanding Space Marines who view him with religious reverence rather than merely military respect. He has worked to reshape that dynamic, to remind them that he is not a god but a general, not infallible but experienced. The results have been mixed. 10,000 years of conditioning are not easily undone. But the Ultramarines adapt, as they have always adapted. They learn from their Primarch's example, incorporate his new tactics and strategies, and maintain the traditions that have served them well for 10 millennia. They are in many ways the perfect synthesis of old and new, of the Great Crusade and the Dark Imperium, of the practical and the idealistic. The story of the Ultramarines is in many ways the story of the Imperium itself. Born in the crucible of the Unification Wars, forged into the greatest of the Space Marine legions during the Great Crusade, bloodied but unbroken by the Horus Heresy, and persevering through 10,000 years of endless warfare. They have been the example that other chapters follow, the standard against which all others are measured. From the savage warborn drawing their first recruits from Terra's most resistant tribes, to the disciplined legion that conquered 500 worlds under Guilliman's command, to the shattered survivors of Calth who fought on in the underground tunnels, to the scattered chapters of the Second Founding who carried on their Primarch's legacy, to the current generation who fight alongside that returned Primarch in the Indomitus Crusade, the Ultramarines have embodied the very best of what humanity can achieve. They are not the most savage fighters, that honour belongs to the Space Wolves. They are not the most secretive, that would be the Dark Angels. They are not the most artistic, for the Blood Angels claim that distinction. But they are the most balanced, the most adaptable, the most consistently excellent across every sphere of warfare and governance. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Ultramarines stand as a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when facing impossible odds, humanity endures. We are the Ultramarines, the Sons of Guilliman. Whilst we draw breath, we stand. Whilst we stand, we fight. Whilst we fight, we prevail. Nothing shall stay our wrath. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of the 13th Legion, please hit that like button and subscribe to Obsidian Scriptorium for more Warhammer 40k lore content. There's so much more to explore in this rich, detailed universe, and I'll be bringing you comprehensive guides to every faction, every major character, and every pivotal moment in Imperial history. Thanks for watching, and the Emperor protects.